In this video, I'm going to teach you how to smash the abstract reasoning. Hi, I'm Dr. Hilton, and this is the channel where we make your application to medical school bulletproof. So over my years of teaching UCAT, I've found that there is really only one true technique that works and is the most effective when we're talking about the abstract reasoning. And in the next few minutes, I'm going to teach you exactly how to employ that technique for your own exam day. And the abstract reasoning of the UCAT is the section that tends to stress students out the most. So in this lesson, I'm going to teach you the short version that I teach my students to help them overcome this stressful section. So let's quickly have a look at what UCAT actually want from us when they're testing our abstract reasoning. Abstract reasoning assesses your ability to identify patterns amongst abstract shapes where irrelevant and distracting materials may lead to incorrect conclusions. The test therefore measures your ability to change track, critically evaluate and generate hypotheses, and requires you to query judgments as you go along. So really what they're testing is your spatial reasoning, similar to the kind of thing that you come across in an IQ test. And that means that you're typically identifying patterns between different sets of shapes, and when we introduce a new shape, working out whether it matches either of those sets. So the aim of the abstract reasoning is to test spatial reasoning, identifying patterns, ignoring distracting materials, and rethinking your hypotheses along the way. So let's talk a bit about the question format. So for the abstract reasoning questions, you will have 11 question sets, each containing 5 questions associated with that set of patterns. So that means for the entire abstract reasoning, you'll be presented with 55 questions in total, and you'll have 13 minutes to answer this subtest, which means about 14 seconds per question. However, for these, it helps to think of them as sets because you'll spend the majority of your time working out the pattern and then a smaller portion actually answering each individual question. So now I'm going to show you the different types of questions that come up and how to best tackle each one. Just like the rest of the UCAT, this is a very time-pressured section, but I'm going to show you that with a bit of practice, you'll quickly get the hang of all the questions. It's one of those sections that's quite hard to learn but then easy to master. So when I teach you these techniques, I want you to start slow and then gradually start speeding up the process by which you answer the questions. So in the abstract reasoning, you're going to see 4 different types of questions. So for the first type, you'll be presented with 2 sets of shapes labeled set A and B. And then you're going to be given a test shape and asked to decide whether the test shape belongs to set A, set B, or neither. For type 2, you will be presented with a series of shapes, and then you'll be asked to select the next shape in the series. For type 3, you'll be given a statement involving a group of shapes. Then you'll be asked to determine which shape completes the statement. And then for type 4, again, you'll be presented with 2 sets of shapes labeled A and B, and then you're going to be given 4 response options and asked which belongs to set A or set B. And type 4 might seem similar to type 1, so don't worry, I'll show you the difference between the two later on. So as I say, type 1 and type 4 will have 2 sets of grids of 6, and each of the boxes will contain a number of items. And then on the right, you'll have your test shape, and the question will say, does this shape belong to set A, set B, or neither of the sets? And remember, when you're selecting whether it's A or B, the test shape must fit with the pattern for all 6 of the boxes of either grid that you select. So for it to be neither, it needs to be one of 3 things. It either goes with none of the boxes in any of the grids, it only goes with some of the boxes for either set, or actually the pattern fits into both. So now let's talk a little bit about technique. There are basically 2 approaches that you can do when tackling these questions. The first is a basic one that I want you to consider as your fallback safety net that you can rely on in all instances. And then the second one is a bit more nuanced and advanced that will help you go faster when you're doing this under the time pressure. So the first one is the basic approach, which is going to be done in 5 stages. The first step is to ignore the test shape altogether and just look at the question grid. Now this will sound exactly the opposite of what we recommend in the verbal reasoning. So then you look at the grid and look at the top left box and make a theory about what you think might be going on with the pattern. Then you move on to the next box and see if it applies, and keep going until you have found something that fits all 6 boxes in that grid. If as you're going through them, the pattern or your theory is disproven, you just go back to the top left box again, make a new theory, and start going through the process all over again. The third step is that you identify the pattern that you think it is. Now there are a limited number of patterns that it can be, and I'll explain that in the next few minutes. Then once you've identified a pattern, you need to compare it with the other grids, so set A and set B, how they compare and how they differ, and identify the key difference between the 2. And only then do you go back to look at the test shape and identify which of the grids that it fits into. So remember I said there are only a few pattern types? Well, now I'm going to introduce you to an acronym that you can apply to all situations to give you an idea of some of the patterns that it could be and help you work out what is going on with these shapes. So if you will, I want you to take a second, close your eyes and place yourself back in ancient Troy. And there's a big battle going on on between the Spartans and the Trojans, and there's one particular Spartan, Gerard Butler, who's on the battlefield fighting away, but all of a sudden he realizes that he really needs the toilet. And the problem is he has to rush off and leave the battlefield because unfortunately he suffers with IBS. And although that is of course a ridiculous story, that is because the acronym that's going to help you remember these patterns is called Spartan IBS. And Spartan IBS stands for the shape, type, position, angles, route and direction, touching sides, area and size, number of items, intersections, borders, and shading. And don't worry, because later I will go through some examples of each of these pattern types and how to answer the questions. And within these patterns, there are usually two types of relationships. Either a fixed one, so for example, there are 3 red circles in every box in set A, or maybe a dependent one. So for example, when the circle is colored black, then the square is always white. And then when you're comparing between set A and set B, there are essentially only 3 ways that the two grids can differ. That might be absolute numbers. So for example, there are 2 triangles in every box in set A, whereas there are 3 in every box in set B. Odds and evens. So set A, for example, might have an even number of circles, whereas set B has an odd amount of circles. And then very rarely you can get less or more than. So set A might have less than 3 circles in each box, whereas set B might have more than 3 circles in each box. So let's go through some tips for these types of questions, and then I will talk a bit more about the more nuanced technique that will help you go faster. The first tip is sometimes it helps to actually just take a step back and take a bird's eye view of the patterns, because sometimes the pattern will actually be quite obvious when you look at the entire grid as a whole. Number 2 is that you don't always have to start with the top left box of set A. If you're struggling with that one, you might just want to move to a random box on the other grid, and that will help you start figuring out potential solutions to the pattern. 3 is to not let this section drive you too mad. There will be patterns where you just simply can't work it out, and in that instance, because of the time pressure, just guess. There's no negative marking for having a go, and then just move on to a question where you're more likely to understand it and know the answers and ultimately get the marks. And the final tip is to just trust your gut. There's lots of evidence why your gut is actually correct in a lot of situations, so just trust it. So the second technique that will help you go faster is one I call the intuitive technique, because it's something that actually comes with more practice, and after doing a lot of these questions, you really just get a feel for whether something's right or whether it fits or not. And that will come when we look at the specific type of questions that you get, as there's a slightly different intuitive technique for each one. But I'll give you an overview of kind of the thing that we're looking for when doing this speedier technique. So as you go through, you'll start recognizing some recurring patterns. The kind of times when this will work is when you have patterns that look similar to words or letters. You also get some where you get an overwhelming amount of shapes, and there'll be an intuitive way of deciphering which pattern you need to elicit. Sometimes you get very chaotic patterns, and another one where you get nothing but loads of arrows. But luckily, there are a limited number of the types of questions and patterns they can ask on this. So if you want to have a look at how to do the intuitive technique for each of those, you can either check out my online course where I go through it in depth, or you can have a look in one of this playlist here or one of the videos here.